never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dungeon Master of None. It's just me today, Rob, with a special bonus episode of Actual Prep. You have probably heard me and Matt, or me, talk about the campaign that I ran a few years ago, Thunder on the Steppe, and how I've been wanting to work on that campaign book and revive it for a while. So this is really just kind of a working session, I guess, and an accountability project. So now that it's on the timeline, now that it's existent in the podcast records, archives, and you've heard it, I can't continue to waffle. So I'm going to sort of like talk through my process, and I hope that as I do this, you might find something useful about how I approach working on this campaign book, on the setting, and some of the problems that I'm having. So my hope is that this will be interesting to you, but also this is just a way for me to sort of bounce my ideas off of a nebulous audience that may or may not be listening, and to force myself to get to work on this. So what is Thunder on the Steppe? So the idea behind this campaign, and it was really actually very simple, was it started with the Pathfinder First Edition rules. And I liked a lot of things, I still like a lot of things about Pathfinder First Edition, but one of the things I liked a lot was the mounted combat rules. There had not been very interesting mounted combat rules in previous editions of D&D, and there were. In first edition Pathfinder, there are a bunch of rules for mounts and for fighting from horseback and for doing ranged combat, charges, a bunch of cool classes like the Cavalier and the Samurai and so on and so forth, the Sohei. And I really liked that. I really wanted a campaign that took advantage of those rules, but most campaigns are sort of centered on dungeons, or at least some sort of dungeon crawl. And Kingmaker might have been a good option for this, but I had already played through Kingmaker a couple of times, and even during the initial hex crawl part, it does eventually become kind of a dungeon crawl, or there are a lot of dungeon crawls wherein having a horse or something is more of a liability than an asset, or at least it feels very silly. So I wanted to work on a homebrew campaign that took advantage of those rules. And I was also, at the time, I think, taking a course in grad school on the Mongol Empire. And so there was really sort of like an obvious connection between the two, and an obvious next step, which was to write a campaign setting, to design a campaign that drew its inspirations from the Mongol Khanate, the Mongol Empire. And so that's what I did. I also, and this was not a deliberate choice, but as I started working on it, I really decided I liked it. I also centered orcs and half-orcs in this campaign because I like them. I think they're neat. I think that they're kind of they've been relegated to, some vaguely racist stereotypes, or just treated as monstrous enemies to fight. And I think that they're just kind of interesting. I always like to rescue things like the orc from their place as just a generic enemy. And so I started working on this campaign where the Orchok Khanate was ascendant over the steppe lands and had created this grand empire, and he united all the lands under one banner. And I also wanted this campaign to hinge on one of the most pivotal moments that I see, or sort of an analog to one of the most pivotal moments in history, which is the death of Ogadai Khan in 1241. And the death of Ogadai caused Baku Khan and Gormuk and some of the, not Gormuk, Gormak is a guy I made up. Baku and a couple of other Khans who were in the process of pushing deeper into Europe to turn around and return to Mongolia to help decide who was going to be the next Khan. There's a lot of discussion about how important this is, but it is a really pivotal moment, and maybe the reason why the Mongols did not make it further into Europe. And so I wanted to set a campaign at a sort of like similar moment, at the death of a powerful Khan and the decisions that would be made after that, and the players could be involved in deciding the future of the empire. So that's sort of the grand idea behind the Thunder on the Steppe campaign setting. Now, there's a couple of things about that you may have figured out are now kind of trickier than when I had first started working on it, which is one, that I don't run campaigns in first edition Pathfinder anymore. And I'm not against it, but I probably wouldn't return to that. I like second edition more, and I might want to run it in an entirely different campaign. And while I think the campaign setting is really interesting, like I said, a big part of the impetus toward writing this and creating this was to take advantage of these cool mounted combat rules and design essentially an adventure path that would take place almost entirely on horseback. So that doesn't mean that this is not a useful or interesting campaign setting, but it does mean that I kind of need to go about it in a different way. And that if I want it to be applicable to 5th edition or to Pathfinder 2E or just sort of a general purpose campaign setting, that I might need to sort of rethink some of the ways that I have written it and some of the key elements of it, because I had thrown a bunch of things in because they were in Pathfinder 1st edition or because they were interesting parts of Pathfinder 1st edition, either the monster manual or the rules or a class that I thought was interesting. And that can all be repurposed to be more general, but that does take some doing. So I think my first step, my first sort of goal here is to take what I've got and create a Thunder on the Steppe 1.0, which takes everything that I have created and puts it into a campaign document that somebody could use, borrow from, that could be, taken and given to players or to a GM to use as the foundation for a campaign in the Steppe lands, in the world of Thunder on the Steppe. But then I think I would like to, in the future or in the near future, try to adapt it to be less based on Pathfinder 1st edition or have rules for other editions or both. But I want to make some changes. You know, if I were writing a campaign setting from scratch, if I weren't basing it off of Pathfinder, like I wouldn't have orcs. I wouldn't have Vancian casting. I wouldn't have magical swords probably, or at least not the kinds of magical swords that you have in D20 games. I probably wouldn't have any dungeons at all. You know, it would be a whole different type of document. And this is something that we bring up all the time, but like I like how TTRPGs help you derive the story and create the narrative. And that is what they did with Thunder on the Steppe and the campaign that I ran and the campaign setting that I built. But now that I am not as interested in running it in that system, I need to make some changes. But rather than get stuck and do nothing and let it flounder as it has, I'm going to take this big chunk of stuff that I have and try to wrangle it into something useful. It'll obviously be most useful if you want to take it and run it in a Pathfinder 1st edition campaign, but it still has a lot of use if you're going to use it for a different type of game or even a different setting or different system. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I put a lot of effort into it. I still like the idea of a TTRPG adventure that takes place on horseback, where everybody is a rider. You know, part of what I thought was cool about it was that the Mongol Empire brought together all of, like, you know, it spanned from, you know, Austria to Japan. And so you could have a mounted knight and a Mongol archer and a samurai and a Sohai and a Mamluk and all these different warriors and adventurers and people of interest from all over the known world that might form an adventuring party. And I still think that's a really cool idea. And I still think that there's a lot of good stuff there to work with. And so I don't want to abandon the idea or the setting, but I want to make some changes. But I think step one, like I said, is to make what I've got usable. And so I'm gonna try to talk my way through that. So what I have here, and when I release this, hopefully I will have some initial thing to share to show you sort of what it looks like. But I have a player's guide and I have just sort of like a general gazetteer. And we've talked a lot about what we like about campaign settings and what we want to see in a campaign setting. And I think the gazetteer is really important. And I think that a player's guide is critical, something that in a much shorter space tells your players what they're getting, what they're looking at, and what to think about when they are creating their characters. Now, I have too much here. So my problem is that I need to sort of narrow this down into something that's more digestible. I also really should cut. I have a bunch of rules about city rules, city stats. Again, this is Pathfinder first edition. I may put that in like an appendix or something, but that doesn't need to be in sort of the first, Steplands guide, Thunder on the Steppe player's guide, that sort of thing. This was all very much just like me writing it out as I was thinking about it. So I have a bunch of stuff in the Steplands guide, which is not critical, that can be moved to a later document or to an appendix or something like that. I have 2 or 3 factions, but they actually aren't the factions that were most important. So I really should try to move the ones that are supplementary that I ended up not using to, again, a later document, an appendix, and focus on the ones that are critical. There also probably needs to be, I need to revisit this and sort of go over the flow and address some sort of like high level stuff before I start jumping into the, deep lore and history of the world. Matt and I talked about this recently, but like if you are writing a campaign setting or if you're writing a rule book, you don't want to immediately go through the creation myth of your world. This was something that we saw in Wildmount, which was otherwise a pretty good book, but you don't actually get into the relevant world history until, a third of the way through the book. I do think that there is a place for that in a setting book, and so I'm going to keep it, but I think that what I need to do is I need to go back to this, explain the idea behind the setting like I have just done to you, what's interesting about it, why you would want to play in this, what sort of games, what sort of adventures does this allow you to tell, as well as sort of like a list of inspirations and other things to read or to watch or to listen to that might help you think about the type of game that Thunder on the Steppe would lend itself to. So start there and then get into sort of the, what does this world look like? And I have, there are 4 or 5 main regions of the Steplands of Thunder on the Steppe. There is the steppe itself, which is where the Orchok Khanate exists. And I wrote a lot about it, but I don't actually have like a section on the steppe itself, which is kind of silly. It's the center of the sort of known world that I have made here. There's Avadrabad, which is, it's roughly China. It's a Tengu avian mountain empire that was the first thing that the Orchok conquered. There's Ignatia Major, which is very roughly the Khwarazm Empire, or one of the early like Turkish states. It's the the Middle East. There's deserts and jinns. There's not and a lot of the things that I came up with were not brilliantly original, but I tried to put a little like twist on things, and I don't think I failed massively. But I think that for the 2.0 or for the revisiting, I think I'd like to get a lot more creative. And then there's Albion, which is very roughly Europe, and where there are knights and all that. And actually, that was, aside from a few knightly orders and some enemies, that one was pretty like roughly sketched out. So I would want to put a little bit more effort into that. There's also the elves are a seafaring race. They all come from sort of like the Mediterranean. The gnomes live on a big island off of the coast. So again, I would not, if I were starting from scratch here, have all of this sort of like racial essentialism. I probably wouldn't have all of these D&D species in the first place, but I don't need to sort of reinvent the wheel here. I have other things that I'm working on where I get to be a little bit more creative, and there's still a lot of interest and value here. And just because that's not exactly what I'm excited about in the moment doesn't mean that there's nothing useful or interesting here. And I can borrow ideas and changes that we have, worked on throughout the last few years, incorporate a bunch of the advances in how we talk about D&D species and how we approach these different cultures from Pathfinder 2e and from 5e and all that. So I'm going to do that. But so I think the first step is to revisit this and to write, start with, here's what you're looking at. Here's why you might want to play in this. And then here's the Orchok and the steppe and the sort of like center of the world, like the most important people, the most important cities, factions. One thing that I didn't do as well as I would have liked, that I think that I would like to do better as I revisit this, is there were a lot of cool NPCs, but I kind of just threw them together or made them up on the fly or just wrote down a name and a couple of things. And I would like to put a lot more NPCs into the document when it that you will actually see, or that I will actually present to people. And I would also like to put a few more factions, minor factions, because I love a secret society. I have a bunch of these big global, basically conspiracy groups that are working throughout the steppe and elsewhere, but I also want to include some of the smaller scale stuff. And this was a problem. This is a consistent problem that I have as a game designer and a writer, is that I often tend to, bring in all of these different bits and, grand conspiracies and connections from all over the world. And that stuff is fun, but also I also can't neglect the little stuff. I think that's also very important. And so, as I am going through this, I want to focus on that a little bit more. So, as we're talking through this, or as I'm talking through this with you, I'm getting sort of a checklist of things that I want to work on. And if we're looking for, and the purpose here is to get sort of like a minimum viable product, right? And so if I want a GM to be able to take this and mine it for ideas, or start a game in Thunder on the Steppe, I have most of what they need, but it needs to be reorganized, and it needs to be, there are a few more things that need to be included. And Matt and I have talked a lot about designing campaigns, designing worlds. And so, as I'm sort of flipping through my notes and what I have, a few things that are missing, right? The steppe is underdeveloped. I am missing important NPCs. I don't have enough cities, so I need to make sure that I have written out at least a little bit about each of the major cities and each of the major regions. I don't have enough small factions. I need to make sure that I include things like, local guilds and nobility and religious groups and, minor orders, all that sort of thing. And I also more or less entirely neglected deities for some reason. I think I had decided that in Thunder on the Steppe, people were they worshipped concepts, and clerics and paladins drew their strength from ideals rather than from a pantheon, which I still think is neat. I'll probably keep, but I should actually like write out and be specific about how religion works, and if your game includes clerics and paladins and other divine casters that draw their power from a certain source, where that source is and how they draw it from. And then I think I need to elaborate a little bit on the what players need to know to get started in this campaign. Because I have written out a bunch of basic stuff about each of the various D&D ancestries, but because I was running this for my friends in a very specific moment, and I was able to sort of like introduce them in that first session to this idea of the death of a major Khan, none of that is written out in any of these documents. So I'm realizing there's sort of like a big major hole where that might be. So I need to make sure to ultimately be a lot clearer about, if you're a player, what do you need to know? If you are part of the Orchok Khanate, what your role is. If you're not, how you might be involved with the campaign that you want to run. Is it important? Do you have to be an orc? All these things. No, you don't have to, but etc. So on. I also, just I don't know, a warning to the rest of you. I'm realizing that I have a whole lot of notes, and they're not very well labeled, and a lot of the things that I think that I need to do are probably in there somewhere, but I'm going to have to go through and shuffle things around, edit, cut, so on and so forth. So I guess if you are starting your own campaign, if you're doing a homebrew, let this be a word of warning to you. Learn from my mistakes. Do as I say, not as I do, and take better notes. Be more organized. Don't be like Rob. I also, part of the reason why I'm motivated to do this is Matt and I have talked a little bit about I've started working with InDesign. And so this is a good chance for me to practice taking this and making it more presentable, putting it into a document in columns with art and with sidebars and pop-outs instead of just a big chunky Google Doc, which it kind of is right now. And so I have an opportunity to do what I already wanted to do, which was to make this legible, intelligible, useful to someone else. But also I was going to have to revisit this and make some edits and put some serious effort into it in order to get it to make sense in an InDesign document instead of just, again, like this mess of notes for myself. So it's not a huge disaster that it's so messy, but I do need to go through and revisit it. And speaking of sort of like what you need for a campaign setting, because I was writing this again for my own campaign where I knew exactly where I wanted the players to go, I don't have any hooks. I don't have any sort of like adventure seeds. And so if I was going to make this available to other people to use, I definitely need to write out a bunch of adventure seeds, a bunch of hooks, a bunch of things that you could use to start their own campaign or that you could draw inspiration from in order to get going. And that's fun and easy for me. And I think the last thing that I want to do sort of for 1.0 to get this kind of out the door as I work on a better version of this is to sort of center, again, the horseback. It's to think about what does it mean to come from a culture that is nomadic, that carries their possessions with them, and for you to be, or your players to be, adventurers or player characters that are always mounted or almost always mounted, that are like the Scythians, that are like the Mongols, that are like the Huns, that are like any of the mounted warriors or nomadic peoples that appear so frequently throughout history but have so little written history for us to draw from. And one thing that I would really like to do for 2.0 is get weird with it. Right? Part of the issue, or not issue, but part of the challenge for me is that in D&D, you have lots of things that you can ride that are not just a horse. And while I think the idea of just, mounted combat, horses, low magic fantasy is fun, if we're operating within this framework, then there should probably also be hippogriff riders and mounted warfare platforms on rocks and, dragon riders, obviously, and all of these things. And I never really quite got how to make that work, how to make that feel right, have the horde also include all of these flying mounted warriors. But I think actually it would be kind of neat if the sort of the elite riders, the most skilled and talented and, the most decorated of the Orchok did ride on flying mounts or more interesting magical beasts. So I might sort of lean on that, but I want to have a little section or a little bit of detail on how I would run a mounted campaign and what that would look like, how that would be different, and some ideas for you, the GM, to use to do your own campaign, to run a campaign that takes place from horseback, that centers that movement. And obviously, in case, it isn't clear, that would probably involve some hex crawls or point crawls or, knowing the travel rules or using, knowing how far you can go on horseback and how to stay on a horse or how to treat your horses, animal caretaking, all this stuff. But little bits of what you might want to focus on if you're running a mounted campaign instead of a dungeon crawling campaign, what to focus on instead of torchlight and rations, So that's all what I'm thinking about. That's all what I'm going to work on. And I think that when you are designing your own homebrew, your own campaign, you're mostly writing for an audience of one, for yourself, right? But I actually think it's a good exercise to think about what it would look like if you were going to present it to somebody else, or if you were going to try to share it for free or to put it up for sale or something like that. Because I think that forces you to be a little bit more focused, a little bit more disciplined, and to think through challenges that you might not immediately think of. So, which is why I'm doing this thing sort of publicly for all of you. And I've already come up with a bunch of, I think, good next steps. So I'm excited to get back to work on Thunder on the Steppe. And now that I have, put it out there that I am going to do it, I have to do it. So I will hopefully have something to share, a limited document in the very, very near future. And then not too much later, hopefully, I will have a much more detailed, much more interesting full campaign gazetteer document that I hope that some people will be able to take, but, and use. But I think that if there is, defending myself, I suppose, from accusations that I myself am making, the reason why this is interesting and why it perhaps is worth existing and why anyone else might care is because I think that the idea of a mounted campaign is really, really cool. And I don't think that there's a lot of games that really do a good job of addressing or thinking about what it would look like to exist in a world or campaign or play in a world where everybody is nomadic, or the most powerful and dominant people are nomadic, and what it looks like to be a group of PCs that are always mounted and who are doing most of their adventuring or solving most of their problems or existing in the world alongside their horses or their, saber-toothed lions or whatever. So that, I think, is the thing I really want to focus on. But I want to get a little something out the door for people to start to look at and maybe give me feedback on. And then I want to really like spend some time fine-tuning the world, but also fine-tuning the concept and turn this into something a little bit more interesting. So that's where we're at with Thunder on the Steppe. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble about it. If you have thoughts, suggestions, or questions about it for me, please email me at dmofnone@gmail.com or at me on Twitter at dmofnone. Hit us up on our Patreon, bother me in the Discord, and yeah, well, hopefully we'll be seeing something cool soon, and I really look forward to having something to share. So thanks everybody, and keep rolling them dice.